And I think that we shall start. Pablo, with you, if you could talk about your experience in Mexico and the DF with mental health and systems. Hello and good morning. Yes, good morning. It's still the morning. In some parts of the world it's not, but thank you very much, Selena, and the whole Glasswing organization for the invitation. And of course, I'm more than honored to share this panel with Dr. Lelis Dinarte and of course with the Minister of Education. And without any further ado, I start on the topic. You can see the presentation. He- he's trying to put the slides. I talk quickly so you have a general idea how we're addressing the mental health issues and the prevention of crimes and security of the citizens from the city of Mexico. I will go quickly. What would be the criminological base of this topic? We and maybe simplifying too much, we understand or are starting by an understanding of criminality as a series of diverse acts that occur in a group or a series of situations where there's always a person, a group of people that enter into contact with environments that facilitate or promote the activity, the criminal activity. And these persons are not always people that are inclined or the specific theory is situational or that are not prone or they're prone to uh, carrying out crimes, let's say, to be replaced by violence, and it's an alternative to an action morally feasible. And when they face these environments where at least the majority of people who surround them understand violence as an alternative, feasible or desirable action, enter into contact with these environments, and it being prone to, and that give these criminological environments give a process where first the person from its morals perspective of the to be says or reasons over itself that crime is an alternative, and then when it happens or that decision is affirmative, the people can enter into rational deliberations that have to do with the perception of the different controls, contentions that could exist in their surroundings or experiences within the framework that is being dealt with, like usual, that are reactive, not reasoned, to put it in simple terms. And this could lead to the crime. This rational deliberation that we're talking about shouldn't be understood as rational, traditional rational choice, but the evaluation, interactive and evaluation, very interactive with the decision and by the control that the idea has about that himself and that environment. So it produce or doesn't produce the crime and violent act, all this cumulus of actions and process of actions that I have tried to summarize quickly can generate or could feed back these violence, sustained or systematic violence environments at the time that the individual acts of violence and as the mechanism remains in a permanent way. Okay, you continue. We have a launch with that understanding and starting by the experience and evidence available internationally, particularly in the United States and the City of Mexico, with the support of Innovation Support and Action, INL, and the University of Yale. We have implemented a pilot at this time. It's quite advanced at this time, but we started with a pilot as a ceasefire strategy that is known that way in the United States with a methodology of localized a situation that sees through different tools change the behavior of those people that are more prone to exercise violence in a community. This perspective starts by the assumption that there is in a community less than 1%, even less than zero point 0.5 of the population is responsibility of the greater amount of crimes or armed violent acts that occur in a community, identify those groups that are more prone to exercise violence, and identifying within them who in specific are the persons that are more prone to violence. What we do is use dissuasive uh, uh, terms. People who are chronically violent, you exercise a violent legal act uh, to send the people to prison, but we wish to amplify this dissuasive message, seeing people who are prone to violence to be able to establish the rules of the game and say these are the alternatives of future actions that you have within the environment that you live in. And alternatives being, of course, the example of detention, and the other alternative, and we go to the natural promotion of people for their well-being. We go to the right and have a plan for life in legality, but also to be living far away from violence is supported by a group of people that are mentors. These are coaches for life, to use more simpler terms, but simply they help them to make decisions and guide them through the different decisions that they have to make throughout their lives. And these mentors at no time are substituting the legal act, but they're simply informing what could be the consequences of incurring in illegal acts. All this strategy is supported by a series of specialized services that come from the provision of feeding services, better housing, and we also have support program which is called healing and immediate response, and in workshops, and also referring to workshop, we have also worked on this for their development, and a support that is called Phoenix, that is a support of workshops uh, for their behaviors. Heal is what is usually called to an intervention to reduce hospital violence. What we seek is that all the people who are injured by shots could have a close uh, relation working with their people and social workers in the hospitals to make contention. And then you can see some of the faces. I'm going to refer to some of the faces. But basically, it's to carry out contention and give advice to be able to detain violent spirals, obviously promoted by or triggered by vengeance or ideas that has to be the retribution, or even because of ideas of toxic masculinity. So what we look for is to give the contention and to avoid these scale up of violence, and this contention and healing is given. I can't really go into a lot of detail through specific attention to trauma with healing workshops, and now we see the topics that are addressed, or behavioral workshop through Phoenix. So we have the accompaniment with technicians that see the cases. They help the family members. They help the state of physical health of the person, but they also, and it's starting by a biosocial, biopsychological, or biopsychosocial um, approach to to take care of the trauma directly, focusing on these components, and the concepts are managed by elements of emotional contention, professional resilience, strategies of resilience, a strengthening of self-care and self-efficiency of people to overcome the traumatic event or the chain of traumatic events, because sometimes what we observe in the work that you do in El Salvador, Selena, with the program that practically that we're inspired on, besides the hospital practices that we have in the United States, what one sees is that the people are victims of violence and are many times victims of violence, and usually are surrounded by people who exercise violence and do it in a consistent way. So we try to give them tools, precisely to overcome their personal trauma of the moment and the series of incidents that they're going through. The person can choose, um, a person can choose, besides entering into topics of these specific workshops in the framework of healing, as we were seeing in the general diagram of the strategy, they can also access to uh, behavioral workshops. But what ends up doing, they first attend the trauma issue and then behavioral. And in the biobehavioral part, we're taking up an experience that was done, is the Fiscalía General of the Republic, and changes the curriculum of biobehavioral curriculum. As everybody knows, with this, what we're looking for is that the people can recognize the thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and physiological responses that are dysfunctional in their lives, and can adjust them precisely to avoid negative consequences that these dysfunctional behaviors can bring forward. I'm not going to extend much more, just to conclude, reiterating a bit about what we're doing. We're focusing on people and groups of people that generate the greater part of violence in certain territories in the city of Mexico. We're placing attention on the people and the violence they generate, so that from a perspective that we call of justice and security, to place clear limits in the exercise of violence, and if efficient, effective, and clear consequence, and treating the people as adults, which are people who are, most of them are adults because they're capable of making decisions. So we're also placing on the table alternatives for the way they conduct their lives, being conscious on the fact that they live in environments and can generate a lot of trauma. They live in specific environments, and what we want to do is propose these life positions, and help them with mentors, and through mentors with COVAX they can come closer to the people, to the ones that they advise to make decisions, and bring them to different workshops to help them with the problems of trauma and Phoenix that are complementary in any way. Independently, the people do not go through this process, a central process that just described. All of the people that are victimized by firearms also enter into this logic, understanding that sooner or later this group, both victims and aggressors, tend to be the same, where in a very frequent manner, I don't want to criminalize, who are victims today are usually aggressors later on. And what we're looking for, as Selena was saying, recalibrate the system in the system of violence, because everything is interconnected. And behind, there is a system of institutional governance with the participation of many institutions that generally are not don't usually come close to the situations of violence, but when you integrate to a systemic situation, you see that health and social development and all the hospital versions and psychological treatment and prosecutor's office, justice, intelligence, and financial intelligence, they come together and they work together. I would conclude with this, and of course I'm open to any question, and to mention that what has resulted for us in this, we would have to analyze it. Um, we haven't been, so we have to say that we would be the only responsible, but we have seen resolutions that are above 40% in the incidence of homicides by firearms. Yes, Pablo, I'm going to ask you many questions over that, but I would like to give the floor. And I know that Madam Minister is always very busy, and I thank her so much for being here. But I would like to give her the floor because I know she has had commitment before being a minister and now being a minister with with mental health. And I would like to listen to her about your perspective on mental health and behind the educational system.
Muchas
Thank you very
gracias,
much for being
Celina.
here.
Muy
Thank you very much,
agradecida
Selena.
por la
Very grateful
invitación.
for the
A
invitation.
pesar de las múltiples
Despite
ocupaciones,
the multiple
yo siempre le doy
occupations,
un espacio
I
especial a
always
este
give
tema,
a special
porque estoy
space to
consciente,
this topic
sobre
because
todo
I
en el
am
sistema
conscious,
educativo, que no
particularly
podemos
the educational system,
trabajar con
that
maestros
we
que tienen
cannot work with
heridas sin sanar,
professors that have
trabajar con
wounds
niños
that have not been healed,
que
and that they work
necesitan
with
un
children that
abordaje de una
need
persona que
the
esté más o
kindness
menos
of a person
equilibrada.
that is
Yo también
prepared.
saludo a
I
Pablo
also
y a Lelis.
wish to greet Pablo and
Mucho gusto de
Lelis.
conocerlos,
It's a
aunque
pleasure
sea por
to
este
meet you,
medio.
even though it's through
Y
this meet.
bueno,
And
Celina sabe muy bien
Selena knows very
que
well
este es un
that
país con
this is a
múltiples
country
heridas sin
with
sanar.
multiple wounds that haven't healed.
Antes de que llegásemos
Before we should get
a esta
to
administración del ministerio,
this
habíamos
ministry,
coincidido con
we
Celina
had
en algunas
coincided with Selena
actividades
in some activities,
particulares de
uh,
sanando heridas,
specific
donde
healing
nos dimos
wounds,
cuenta
where we found
que
out
los maestros
that
y
the
los padres de
teachers
familia
and the
venían
parents
acarreando heridas
uh,
de
and
traumas de la
they have
guerra,
been
de
carrying
traumas de los
traumas from
terremotos, de
the
traumas
war, from
todos
the earthquakes,
acumulados
traumas that are accumulated,
y teniendo que vivir y
and
convivir
having
en
to
un
live
ambiente
and
de violencia
coexist in an
permanente,
environment of
casi permanente.
violence.
Cuando llegamos aquí
When
al sistema educativo, a este
uh,
ministerio,
when I started to form
lo
part of this
primero que me
ministry, the
impresionó
first thing that
fue
impressed me
el Via Crucis
was the
que tenían que recorrer
problems
los
that
padres de
the
familia con los niños
parents
a quien de
had
alguna
to
manera se les había
go
violado
through,
algún derecho.
parents and the children that had been
Tenían que
denied some
andar
right. They
de
had to
institución en
go from
institución
one institution to another,
revictimizándose.
re-victimizing
Entonces, lo
themselves.
primero que hicimos al llegar al
So the
ministerio
first thing
fue
that we did
crear
when I
las
got to the
consejerías
ministry was
escolares,
to create
que
the
están
school
básicamente
possibilities that
conformadas por
are
psicólogos,
made up
trabajadores
by
sociales,
psychologists,
pero
social
también
workers, and
atendiendo la
also
parte jurídica de la
attending
familia,
the
porque
legal
muchas
part of
veces
the
estos
family,
temas
because
tienen
many
que
times
tener
these topics
ese
need
acompañamiento.
to have that
Las
accompaniment.
consejerías escolares, cuando
And
llegó la
school
pandemia, las
advisors, when the
transformamos
pandemic came, which
en un
were
servicio en
transformed
línea
into an
que se
online
juntó con
service that
el centro de
came
llamadas
together
del
with the
ministerio.
call center
Y
from the
cuando empezó el
ministry.
confinamiento,
And
pues se
when
comenzaron a
the
recibir una
lockdown
serie de
began and we
llamadas de
started to
auxilio,
receive a series of
¿verdad? Que no tengo en este momento
uh, calls of
los datos,
assistance that I
pero
don't
es bien
have the data yet, but
interesante
it's
darse
very
cuenta
interesting to
las
realize
razones de la
the
llamada.
reasons of the
Luego nos
calls.
dimos cuenta
Then
que
we
teníamos que
realized
atender
that
al
we had
personal
to
docente desde el
attend
punto de vista
the
psicoemocional, que
teaching
nunca había
personnel
sido tratado.
that had never been treated,
Y creamos un
and
programa
we created
específicamente para
a program
docentes en línea
specifically for
que le
teachers,
llamamos
and it was a program
el
online.
programa de
It was
atención
called the
de
program
autocuido para
for
maestros, que todavía está
self-care
abierto.
attention for
Pero
teachers.
además, en las
It's
guías
still
impresas
ongoing, but
que
also
nosotros hemos elaborado para
the
abordar el tema de la
different
continuidad
issues that we
educativa,
have prepared.
hemos tenido muy en cuenta la
We
salud
also
mental de
have
los
kept in
niños.
mind the mental
Y
health of
desde
the
un
children,
principio
and from the beginning,
recibimos
we
denuncias
received
de
complaints
la excesiva cantidad
from
de
the
tareas
excessive
escolares
amount of
que sobre
school
todo los centros educativos
tasks
privados
that
dejaban
the
a los niños, a los
private
alumnos durante la
schools would
cuarentena.
leave the children
Entonces, al
during the
principio
pandemic. So at the
podríamos decir
beginning,
que
we
fue un
could
poco
say that
caótica la situación,
the situation
porque
was a
como
bit
nadie había estado en
chaotic
estas
because since
condiciones,
nobody had ever been in
y lo
these
principal
conditions,
para los
and
maestros
the main thing
son
for
los
the
contenidos y
teachers
no la
were the
calidad.
contents
Es
and
la
not the
cantidad y no
quality,
la calidad.
it's the quantity and
Entonces
not
se
the quality.
saturaba a los
So
niños,
they saturated the
generando una
children,
situación de mayor
generating
estrés en
a
el hogar,
situation of greater stress
que
in
lo
their
hemos
homes
podido comenzar a
that
evaluar
we
con la
have been
prueba
able to
Avanzo.
evaluate it
Este es
with
un
the
tema pues que
Avanzo
hemos
test.
invitado a Glasswell
This is
y a Celina
a
a que lo
test that we have
escucharan.
invited Glasswin and Selena.
Creo que ustedes estuvieron en
I
la
think that
presentación de la
you
prueba
were
Avanzo y
during
también en los
the
resultados
presentation of the
de las
Avanzo
primeras
test and the
intervenciones
results of the
de
first
autocuido
intervention
colocado a
of
los
self-care
maestros.
that we
Pero es
gave
muy
the teachers.
interesante
But it's very
porque nos hemos dado
interesting
cuenta
because
que
we have
nuestra juventud
realized that our
tiene un alto
youth
nivel de
has a
resiliencia.
high level of
Para
resiliency.
los que no conocen el sistema educativo salvadoreño, la
For those
prueba
of you who do not
estandarizada
know
para
the
bachilleres que
Salvadorian
se llamaba
educational
PAES,
system,
nosotros la hemos
the
cambiado
test
y
for the
diseñamos una
evaluation
prueba
of the
que se
youth was called
adaptase a las condiciones en que
FIAS,
los
and so
alumnos
we
recibieron
started a
clases en este
new
año 2020,
test
unas
of the
condiciones
way
diferentes,
how or the conditions
manejando
that the youth were now
medios que nunca se
studying,
habían manejado,
using media that
encerrados.
have never been used. They were
Entonces
locked down.
incorporamos en la
And so
prueba
we
no solo la
incorporated
parte
in the test
cognitiva,
not only
sino la
the
parte
cognitive
actitudinal,
part, but
el
also
impacto
the
socioemocional
attitude
y
and
la
the
parte
social,
educacional. Y ha sido
emotional, and the
muy, muy
educational part.
interesante
And it has
darnos
been very
cuenta
interesting
que
that
los
we
mayores
realized
niveles de
that the
ansiedad
greater levels
están
of
en el sector
anxiety
privado.
are in the private sector.
Seguramente, o sea, nosotros
Surely,
científicamente no lo podemos
scientifically, we
demostrar,
cannot demonstrate
seguramente
it.
por esa
We
carga
cannot
de
prove it,
tareas
but
y ese
surely
deseo
because of
de
that
que los
load
niños
of
no vayan a
tasks
perder
and the children should not
tiempo, no vayan a perder
lose time
contenidos, al
or
final
lose content,
terminan haciéndole
in
un
the end,
daño al niño,
they
cuando
end
ustedes
up
saben
by
que los
making a lot of
aprendizajes
harm
son
to the children
recuperables.
because
Pero cuando tenemos
they
un
can
problema
recover
de
the time.
eficiencia de
But when we
aprendizaje, si
have
además tenemos
a
un niño con
learning
altos niveles de
deficiency
ansiedad,
problem and high
tenemos
levels
que
of
resolver dos
anxiety,
problemas.
we have to resolve two problems.
Entonces, además hemos
So
iniciado, ¿verdad?,
besides, we
la
started
atención,
with
el autocuido para los maestros que nos
self-care
están
for
revelando
teachers
cosas muy importantes.
and that
O sea,
are generating
hay
very
altos
important
niveles
things. There's
de
high
ansiedad,
levels of
de
anxiety
depresión. Bueno,
and depression.
Celina se dio cuenta cuando hicimos la
Selena could
presentación y
see
eso nos está
that during the
indicando que debemos de
presentation, this is
continuar.
teaching us or
Debemos de
showing
continuar con
us that
ese
we need
proceso
to
porque
continue with that
no es
process
posible
and that it's not
que el que
possible
cuida a mi niño no se
that
pueda
the
cuidar
one who
él.
takes care of my child cannot take care of,
Partimos
of
de la
itself.
lógica
And we
de
start by
que
the
yo me
logic
cuido para
that
poderte
I
cuidar a
take
ti.
care of myself to
Entonces
be able to
tenemos
take care of
esa
you.
opción para todos los
So we
maestros,
have
pero
that
al mismo
option for the
tiempo
teachers, but at
sabemos
the same
que
time, we
tenemos que
know
evaluar el
that we have to
impacto que ha tenido la
evaluate the
pandemia en los
impact that the
niños.
pandemic has had on
Y
the children.
lamentablemente
And
nosotros teníamos
unfortunately,
ya en nuestro
we
protocolo
already
planeado que
had
los
in
niños
our
regresaban a
protocol
clases de
plan that
forma
the children
semipresencial
will
en
return
febrero y hemos
back
tenido
to
que
school in
posponer
February. We've had to
esa fecha.
postpone
Pero
that
el tema
return to
psicoemocional
classes,
está
but the
totalmente integrado y
psychosocial
para lo
problem
cual
is
hemos pedido
completely
apoyo a
integrated, for
Glassman,
which we've
en
had
el sentido que tenemos
support,
que preparar a
and
todos
in the
nuestros
sense that we
maestros
have to prepare all
en
of our
habilidades
teachers
para poder aplicar
and
ciertos
skills to be
instrumentos
able
que
to apply
evalúen el
certain
impacto que
tools
los
that
niños han
evaluate
tenido
the
durante la
impact that the
pandemia
children have had
y poderles
during the
dar una
pandemic, and to be
atención,
able to
los primeros
offer
auxilios
attention
psicológicos y
or
aquellos que
psychological first
detectemos que
aid, and
tienen
those that we
algún
detect
problema
that
que
have
necesita
a
seguimiento,
problem
entonces
that needs follow-up,
poderlos
to be
referir.
able to
Entonces, en
refer
este
them.
momento
So
vamos a iniciar
at
la preparación
this
de los
moment, we're
maestros
going to
para que
start on the
puedan adquirir
preparation of
estas
the teachers so
habilidades
they
y
can
métodos
acquire these
y
skills and methods,
vamos a
and
continuar
we will
con los
continue
contenidos de salud
with the
mental,
contents of mental health,
prevención de violencia a través de
violence
las diferentes
prevention
plataformas
through
que
different
tenemos a la
platforms
disposición
that
para la
we have
continuidad
at our
educativa, como las
disposal for
guías impresas,
the
la
educationalized
radio,
via
la
impress,
televisión y
printed
las plataformas en
means,
línea, como la
radio, and
plataforma de Google
online
Class.
platforms.
Para nosotros es un tema prioritario,
For
el tema de
us,
la
it's a
salud.
priority.
El grupo más crítico que en
The
este
most
momento hemos
critical group
encontrado es
that we have
el grupo de
found
los docentes, de
is
los
a group
maestros.
of the teachers.
Todavía no sabemos en qué
We
medida
still do not
los niños
know
más pequeños están
in what
afectados, pero
measure
los
are
bachilleres
that the
que se
younger
graduaron el año
children are
pasado
affected, but
con la nueva
the
prueba
students that
Avanzo, nos hemos dado
graduated
cuenta
last year with the
que tienen
Avanzo
un alto
test,
nivel de
we realize they
resiliencia,
have a high level of
tienen una
resilience.
actitud
They
muy
have
madura
a
del tema
very
de la
mature
pandemia,
attitude towards
eh,
the
quieren seguir
pandemic, they
estudiando,
want to
tienen el
continue
deseo de
studying,
seguirse
they wish
superando,
to
lo
continue
cual es muy alentador
becoming
porque
better,
no hemos
which is
encontrado,
wonderful
digamos,
because
una
we haven't
señal,
found
una luz roja que nos diga
a red
nuestros
light that
jóvenes
says our
están
youth
afectadísimos por
are
la
very
pandemia, no quieren
affected
seguir, están,
because of the pandemic and they don't
tienen un
want to
nivel
continue
de
and they
ánimo
have
muy bajo y no
a
es así.
level of
Estamos muy
uh,
contentos
of
porque el resultado de
feeling
la
it is
prueba nos
very
ha
low, but we're
arrojado
very
una
pleased
juventud
because the
que
result
quiere
of the
continuar,
test
que
has
quiere
given us
mejorar, que
the
quiere
results
estudiar.
of a youth and
Nuestro
want
gran
to
desafío
improve, want
ahora
to
es
study,
brindarles
and our big
esas
challenge is to
oportunidades.
offer
Ahora
them those
estamos
opportunities.
preparándonos para ver
So
cómo
now
la
we're
pandemia
preparing to
afectó a
see
los más
how
pequeños.
the pandemic affected the
Ese es el gran
youngest.
desafío,
This is a
en
big
eso
challenge.
estamos
This is
y
where we're
bueno,
at.
contamos con el apoyo de
And so
nuestros
we
socios
count with
de clase.
our partners. Thank you very much, Madam Minister. I would like to highlight that some of the things that we're going to talk about. I know that you have another meeting, so when you have to leave, we understand that you're very busy. But I just would like to mention, talking about systems, that in fact, when we were working on a project with one of the United Nations agency, a pilot on mental health, one of the reasons why we couldn't continue was precisely because it was not scalable. Even though it was a very good intervention, it was not scalable. So I think it's very important that we take into account organizations that we implement and design. First of all, as Pablo and the minister was saying, to have to understand the context, we have to understand who we're talking with or what we're working with and think of strategies that can be used and scaled. There's a big challenge. We thank you very much, and we thank you for your specific effort in
Gracias,
mental health.
Celina.
Thank you very
Con
much,
este
and thank
tema
you,
del
Selena.
sistema,
With this
decirte
topic
que
on the system, I want to say
lo
that
que vamos a hacer sí es
what we will
escalable, porque lo
do,
estamos
it is
haciendo
scalable
a nivel de todos los alumnos. Por
at the
primera vez el
level,
país
at all
tiene una
levels.
evaluación de sus
It has
bachilleres,
an
que son
evaluation of the high
aproximadamente
school
70
students,
mil.
approximately
Y con el
70,000
apoyo de todos
youth,
ustedes
and with the
vamos a
support
evaluar
from
al
all
resto
of
de los
you,
alumnos. Sé
we're
que
going to
va a ser
work with the rest
totalmente
of the
escalable.
students. It's totally scalable. Very good. That's a challenge for the organizations that are outside of the public system to support with scalable strategies so that the governments, local and national governments can scale
Gracias a
up.
ustedes y
Thank you very much.
felicitaciones por
Thank
el
you so
trabajo
much
que
and
están haciendo
congratulations
en
for
sus
the work that
respectivos
you do
países.
in your
Gracias, Celina.
respective countries. Thank you, Selena. Now I give the floor to Dr. Lelis Dinarte from World Bank. Lely, thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much, Selena, and to the organizers for the invitation. Pleasure to share the panel with Pablo and the minister. And as Selena mentioned, I'm a researcher from the World Bank, so I would like to take advantage of the space to talk about 2 points. First, briefly discuss the relevance of mental health from the economic point of view. And second, inspired on the evidence that exists, there's some preliminary outcomes of the impact of healing lives, which was precisely the healing program that Pablo was talking about, implemented through the school system in El Salvador. We start by talking about the importance of mental health in the economic area. For many years, mental health has taken up a lot of relevance for the investigators, and this has been for many reasons. But in cases of countries like El Salvador, and as Pablo was mentioning, Mexico, it's mainly because of associated with crime and violence, different to other countries, indicates that the increase substantially in economic areas and health and create obstacles for economic growth of the country. To give you an example of why this can occur, in the case of El Salvador and the Central Reserve Bank, and one of the most violent years of El Salvador was 2014, they estimated to try deal physically a violent injury can cost about $20,000 by investors. In 2014, they attended approximately 21,000 patients, victims of violent acts. This introduced only that year nearly $20 million for that year just for physical health. When you're a victim of a violent act, it also not only affects our physical violence, like the previous panel was mentioning, because it can also have emotional and psychosocial effects and affects, in the end, our mental health, complementing these estimates of the physical health, central bank talked about the cost of psychological moments that it can go from $2,300 up to $6,000 by event by patient. So we in 2014, the total cost of victims of violent acts was approximately $704 million, which for that year was even greater than the budget for the Ministry of Health is like 1.1% higher. In this sense, the climb of violence and crime for our country is a question. One of the question is that Pablo was talking about what can we do to reduce these negative effects. We assume that we cannot change levels of violence. So the question is, what else could we do? International evidence indicates that in the interventions on managing trauma can have positive results. Managing trauma, for example, can reduce the reincidence of violent acts or perpetrators. So, considering these issues of violence on mental health in combination with Glasswing and with the Ministry of Health, the IDB, and the World Bank, we implemented an program of impact of healing lives. And this has a total of three main components. The first one is awareness creation and training the health staff so that it derives to vi- victims of violence that enter into hospitals and that they should derive them for to specialists on mental health, the attention on mental health. And the second element is intervention, and this in derivation or reference to other priority services besides follow-up, which is very similar to healing program that Pablo was presenting. In this sense, the intervention has the objective or the study that we look for is how the program Healing Lives could impact the probability of reinciting on violent acts. Because in the end, we don't want to be spending those $1 million in health, assuming that we cannot control the exposure to violence of a person. This process of the study was activity of collecting data for people that had been attended by like tanks, and Glasswing had presence in 2017, 2019, and then Sacamil. And what were the results that we obtained through that analysis? First of all, what we found was the awareness creation. The first component has an effect to increase the rate of attention and mental health by specialists, and this increase was 58%. In other words, create awareness in the hospital staff has served so that the victims of violence can be treated by a specialist in mental health. A specialist can be in the hospital, but if there's no awareness creation or more systemic treatment, or a more systemic awareness, it's not going to work. The second result that's also interesting is as preliminary estimates show that the program could reduce the probability of incidents in violent acts by more than 30%. In other words, if I was a victim of violence and was attended by the Healing Wounds program, it's less probability that I go back to the hospital to be treated physically or psychologically. The investigators team sees that this reduction to 30% of this reincidence could be lower limits of all the limits of the impact of the program, because we only see the victims that come back to the hospital, but they can go back to any hospital of the health system. When we consider which is in aggregated terms, which would be the saving in cost for the whole health system of the reduction of 30%, it could be of up to $4 million per year. Besides all the benefit that is still not measured, which is greater productivity by the people to continue working, or the family environments, mental health of the family group, etc. In summary, or what I would like you to transmit to you is that the interventions aimed at working on mental health for victims of violence as Pablo was saying, is to reduce costs generated by other types of social problems uh, caused by violence or crime. It could require policies, more complex policies, or more structured. In the case of Phoenix intervention, for example, what are the steps that we want to explore more with the study to see what happens with the people that were attended in healing wounds and other type of results? Let's say if the people enter in the formal system of employment, if the beneficiaries of the program, not like one of the hypotheses of violence, of crime, if there was no a negative effect because of the violence. And this is my presentation. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you. I would like to ask Jeronimo to put up the last slide of Pablo to see what he was saying at the end. And Lelis is also speaking about the statistics. And I would like to that we have the slide as if you hadn't seen it. Wh- When I met Pablo, he was presenting Phoenix program, and I wrote to him and I said, we want to learn what you're doing. And one of the things that you said at the end, Pablo, is that a very high statistic of the outcome of the program, and it has been excellent. So I would like that you could repeat the impact that you've had with this Phoenix program, and you have intervention based on the behavioral um, and how you see the findings. Is another question. How has this program adapted during COVID, taking into account that the Phoenix project is in presence, that you work with youth and adults that are participating, they're present when they, maybe you can tell me about the impact and how you have adapted to this context. Thank you. Of course. First of all, a comment, which is always good to make. What I present is work that I have a very good team and I'm the spokesperson. So I always like to recognize the people who work on these initiatives. I make an appreciation. The impact that I was referring to could be of the strategy, and generally that's called CONTU, that has a dissuasion, part of attention to trauma, and part of behavioral trauma part. And what we have observed in the last year compared to the previous year is reductions in the homicide reduction by firearm by 40% in the zone. This impact was not subject to an experimental evaluation, simply the tracking of the behavior of homicides. And one has to say it in a context where, in general, in the city, registered a very important decrease in homicides. Of course, something must have come from the effect of the health situation. But if we analyze the periods where mobility has been reestablished in the city, the decrease continues. So we have to have a reserve over attributing it only or in large part to the situation where we have done work. And we believe in this zone specifically where we've had impact, but one of the pending issues is to submit a program that we're working on with the partners, the University of Yale and Action, and in order to, through a experimental and non-experimental methodology, to see what part of that distribution can be attributed without being wrong to the strategy as a whole. So that's what we're working on. You know, the challenges that one has, and you said that experimental evaluation, we want to do the experience not as a whole, but the evaluations of the workshops that we've been working together in healing and the Phoenix part. I clarified this is a strategy that's going to stop fire and has these components. Regarding what have we done to continue with the workshops at a distance, It is important to point out that the work or the impact that a workshop in presence of this type could be substituted by a virtual methodology. However, we have adjusted the curriculum and prioritizing some topics and reduced some times because of the distance. And all of the contents of both of a workshop in attention to trauma have been adapted to be given in a virtual way. The biggest challenges is to maintain the work dynamic that you are able to obtain when you have impressive. But I think we've had a good dynamic, and the comment I have to give a excellent recognition to the team that has done excellent work in adapting to a situation that few had foreseen when we launched this strategy to reduce violence. Of course. Thank you, Jeronimo, for the slide. I would like, because we will be closing, I would like to ask Lelis and Pablo if you have something else to add. That what are the main challenges that you see? Pablo, you are in the public system, and Lelis in the World Bank. What are the challenges that you see to be able to reduce the violence that is generated? Yesterday, we saw a lot of strategies based on evidence. How can we translate this into inciting in public policies or to access financing? Because the government cannot take such a large risk. Uh, a, a, a government such as Mexico is a huge country, uh, and how can we go from a systemic intervention, taking into account that we can't take these enormous risks with public funds without being sure that it can work? And what challenges do you see? At the bank, what we always recommend for projects is that you start with pilots. You you were mentioning the context at the beginning. When you don't have such specific evidence for context, you start with pilots. And you start with pilots and being conscious of the fact that they're scalable, because a pilot that is too costly or where you're not going to have human capital or psychologists available at a national scale will not make sense. It will also be a loss of resources. That is it practically. And if you find that with a pilot, the intervention, a well evaluated pilot, as Pablo was mentioning, then you can propose something at a greater scale. You can propose to the governments, and you don't play with public resources, but you invest them correctly. And this is the approach that we're taking. Uh, And to start with local governments, Paulo, you're in the city of Mexico. That's huge, but it's really a very big opportunity to have something in a defined geographic zone, initially with partners. Tell us how this process has been, and if you see possibilities that this is replicated in other parts of the country, taking into account the outcomes that you've had and the challenges that you've had. I think that's something that has helped a lot in the city of Mexico is to deploy these types of strategies, is that there is a decision, a very clear politically decision of the government in general to bid for innovation to resolve problems that have been affecting the city of Mexico for many, many years. This is the first step to be open to innovate. And of course, as Lelis was saying, it's important to start from experiences that have been most rigorously evaluated or that are promising. Many times in our countries, maybe evidence doesn't exist because of the enormous challenges that it takes to build these challenges, but there is indications or practices that are very promises in the impact and the reduction of violence. Of course, it always helps. I want to communicate it as best as possible to have a vision of processes of these strategies, sequence it as best as possible, and structure the projects as flows would be the best way to express it so that each part of the project is can be understood and we can understand what we're affecting with what part of the project and then will allow us to scale up. We have a very clear map of what we were doing and how it could be replicated now with scaling issue, and we would have to see that scaling is always desirable, uh, and including as many beneficiaries as possible. But sometimes the phenomenon that we want to resolve has concentration, specific concentration characteristics in the case of violence. So violence is concentrated a lot, as you know, in certain places, as we are learning of certain people. In this case, to scale is to replicate very detailed projects in areas with very high crime incidence areas. It doesn't say to scale up a vaccination campaign. And the contextual aspect is fundamental to be taken into account the problem that we have in the city. And so the comments also that are asking from Venezuela, Lily, that they're saying that these are, well, Lily was asking if the implementation of the therapy is done by you directly. Your teams are implementing these Phoenix therapies, or if do it through other NGOs, but the implementations have to be more of a process. You can't do make a copy paste, but understand the context. But Magdalena made a comment that if we are able to save and make interventions that we can prove that save money in the public system, the good thing is that that money can be invested in other social programs. So we generate like a virtuous cycle that saves money besides the social impact that we have with regards to trauma, and comments by Anna that there's many more approaches in the last few years. All of us who go to these conferences have seen two things: the cognitive, uh, behavioral therapy is what has to be done. We've seen it in Dr. Patel that there's approaches of counselors or advisors within the population, health promoters. A minister was talking about how she's seen the programs from the Ministry of Education. There's certain different approaches. Victor Franca was see the therapy, and Lisa Mead. So definitely different approaches. So on the part of the donor institutions or research institutions, you focus on strategies and also on some evaluations. So maybe an experimental evaluation is very expensive. Many of us cannot finance an evaluation of that nature when we operate outside of these systems. And so definitely as part of this conference was that to bring different strategies to the table, and we're all trying to address complex approaches in different contexts. And the important thing is that we're trying to elevate mental health to a platform that gives space where it takes up more importance, and we can see how important it is through different sectors and different institutions. And maybe the most important part is to know that each one of us has a possibility to impact on the well-being of the population, that we don't have to be mental health professionals necessarily to prevent anxiety, trauma, violence. And I don't know if you want to say anything else because we have to close or what. And I hope I addressed some of the questions that came up. We are going to share all of the presentations, so don't worry. Melissa and Pablo want to say something else? No, although we saw it from different systems, is security and safety and health. In the end, we could see that the three systems are connected. And so we have a macro system that the uh, public policy formulators always say that, and the experience of mental health should be an official at the police. The experience of stress and trauma is always the experience of stress and trauma. So this intersectorial is important. Thank you so much to all of you for your time, for the work that you're doing. We're learning a lot from the two of you constantly, from Madam Minister, who is no longer with us, and all the panel members. I'm going to give the floor to Jimmy for the closing word. Thank you so much for everything. We thank you millions. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Lelis.